Good morning, Nick. How you doing? You must be jet lagged or something. You were in Europe.
Good morning, my brother. Yeah, I was. I got home, and yesterday was 4th of July. You know this holiday, right? In the
Oh
US, we
yeah,
blow up
well,
fireworks.
Independence Day or something.
Yeah, and it's when we independent from England, and we celebrate by blowing off fireworks. And I have a teenage son, so his thing every year, and he had a buddy over here with him, and we had our family members and a bunch of people, and blowing off fireworks last night. So I had to get off the airplane and then stay up until 6 o'clock in the morning Europe time blowing off fireworks. But yeah, it was
Oh
fun.
gee, geez, yeah.
And you're not in the south of France yet?
No, 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 no. Today is our kids' final school day, so I just picked them up and I took them for lunch because to celebrate their grades or whatever.
Yeah.
And now they're playing with Lego. So, which is a cool age, right? So they're playing with Lego. Daddy gets to record his podcast. Everyone's happy.
And when are you going to your little French villa?
Well, we do well, yeah, the villa. We will go to France, but for a little bit, and then we'll do a pretty cool trip across the Alps, basically. So we start in France, we go via Switzerland, and then visit our good friend Stefan in Austria, and then basically go all the way to the border of Italy, right? So we'll spend 3 weeks traversing the Alps from west to east, if you want, and then we'll come back, and then I'll come to AOM, right? So that's just a couple of weeks
Yep.
leading up to
And then I'll
AOM.
see you in Chicago. So you're like Hannibal. You're going to go from,
Yeah, yeah. I brought my elephant with me, and I'm ready.
yeah.
Yeah. Hey, that's the title of the episode. Hey, buddy. Hey, speaking of fireworks, I got to tell you this. I got to tell everyone this. So, my role on this podcast is, of course, to be very critical of everything you say, and I cherish that role very, very much.
All
But
right.
in all honesty, I don't know why I was doing this, but a couple of days ago, I was actually going to your webpage, and I think well, what I wanted to see if you had a new paper coming out, because let's face it, you have a new paper coming out every month or so. Anyway, didn't find a paper, and then I saw you have this award, you know, tag on your webpage, so I clicked on that, and then you won every goddamn award there is. This is super impressive. You won the dissertation award. I didn't know that. In
Yeah.
2008, you won the Cygnus Award. This is a 1 year after me. I mean, I didn't win it. That's the thing. I came
Oh,
second. I came
okay.
second after Gal Oestreicher Singer. She won, and I
Okay.
was runner
Yeah.
up, and then the famous Nicholas Parenti. And then you won, all editorial awards as ISR and MISQ. You won service awards. You won several best paper and best theory papers of the year. People, whenever this gentleman opens his mouth, you should shut up and listen.
Hey, that's what I've been telling you now for 4 years.
I'm serious, man. Very, very impressive. It's really cool. What a career you're having.
Well, thank you, my brother. That's very nice. Very kind. Thanks for bringing that up. And in return, I looked at your website for awards.
No, yeah. Oh, that's good. Which you did.
No, I haven't actually done that, but I'm sure you've won many awards as well.
Not as many
You
as you
should
have,
warn
my
me.
friend.
You're going to do these things so I could reciprocate.
Yeah, I was just, it's really impressive when you get to see it. I don't know, like, so I think is it like a sports metaphor, like when your career is over, you look back and actually value your awards, or do you think about them much at this point?
Yeah, I don't know. I just moved offices, so I have all of my awards, and I'm running out of bookshelf space, so I had to like shove them all on one little shelf. And
You know
yeah, I
what
was
my
thinking
wife
about it.
does?
It's
My
very
wife
nice.
puts them in the shoe carton and then puts it
Hmm.
in the basement. Seriously.
Yeah, that's
I
where
have
they
very
belong, man.
important sports trophy and then the
Hmm.
carton in the basement.
There you go. And that's really what happens with these awards we win. They
They're
they get
pretty
in
meaningless,
boxes.
except if you're in the bubble.
Well, when you win them, they're a big thing. Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
The funny thing is when I won that dissertation award, I wasn't there. I was working on a
Oh,
paper. I was actually, you know which paper I was working on? It was the qualitative meta-analysis that was published a decade later in
you
MIS
got to be.
Quarterly from
Wait,
my
seriously?
dissertation.
You were working on that in 2008?
Yeah, because it was in my
Crazy.
dissertation. And I win this award, and I was in my hotel room working on a paper. Kale, my advisor, went and picked it up for me. And when they give the award ceremony, he picked it up, and then he sends me a note saying, "This is the most important day of your life, and you're not even here because I didn't go to the ISIS reception." So yeah,
So what happened to me? This was I think 2008, which was in Paris in France. And at that time, I think this was my first ISIS. So I thought the awards thing, I knew I was being nominated. I was in the top three or whatever. So you get an email beforehand.
yeah. No one
Um,
told me that.
Yes. Well, okay. So they did tell me, but I thought that the awards come at the end of the conference. So the
Uh,
second day of the conference, I was just like, "Hey, let's go to the Louvre. Watch the Mona Lisa." And I get a phone call from Michael, my advisor. He's like, "Dude, where are you? We're having a watch lunch." I'm like, "What? It's
oh,
Tuesday." So I rush back to the hotel. I go into this big award luncheon thing that they do.
hmm
And then, in time. So I'm there in time. I go to my seat. I sit there. And then they make everyone, I don't know whether they still do that, but back then, the top three candidates for the award, they made them stand up in the room of
mm,
1,500 people. So
yeah,
1,500 people sitting, eating their smorgasbord, and three little kids stand up. And then one of them wins, which was Gal. Uh,
yeah,
Fair enough. Right. Awesome. And then I
there.
very quietly sit down again.
Hey,
That's it.
but what it meant. So when you're one of three, you had a great dissertation, and for whatever disposition or taste or whatever political intrigue happens in these committees, they pick one over
Yeah.
the others. That's what happens with all these best paper and best whatever, right? So
That is true. That is true. Maybe one insight in the AIS Best Paper Awards, because I'm in the senior scholars pick that, and it's not very political. So what happens is they get out of the senior scholars to take about 20 or 30 of them, like volunteers. I'm usually one of them, and then they give me let's say 10 papers to read,
hmm
5 to 10, all of which they check for conflicts of interest. So I wouldn't look at your paper or, whatever,
yeah,
Andrews or whatever. So I pick 10 papers and they give you a ranking scale. I can't remember, like importance, significance, timeliness, stuff like this. And you're supposed to rank them. And they do
yeah,
this with 40 people across all the papers. And then they just look at the scores. That's it. End of story.
yeah.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Well, it's at least not political.
Well, it's
It's
not political,
fairly
but
unbiased.
if you look at what we did with AOM, it's a smaller group. We had like 5 people, Academy of Management, and we had all of our networks generate. It's kind of like what we do with the podcast, but a little more formal, right? So, of the 5 people, they had their networks. We generated a big set of papers. Then, from those papers, we generated a smaller set where we knew they were CTO members. So now we had that smaller set of papers. Then everyone read everyone, and you picked your favorite one in something you're a specialist in, and then your favorite one in an area that's not your specialty. So now
Ah,
each person
that's kind of like
nominated
what we
two.
do, isn't it?
Yeah. So now each person nominated two. And then we had a call where we discussed each one. So then we knew which ones everyone nominated for best paper, and then we would discuss them. Uh, and then we kind of came up with okay, this is why I like this. This is why I don't like this, and whatever. And really, we actually started somehow an articles in advance snuck in, and then we actually decided we're going to give the best paper to this articles in advance. And then I pulled it up. I'm like, guys, this is an articles in advance. We can't give a best published paper for last year to a paper that is not published yet. Right. So that articles in advance thing is confusing. Yeah.
Yeah, true. But on the other hand, like the way that the AIS runs it, or I think the MISQ does it as well, they pick a paper that by the time the award is out, it's like been published for 2 years. So like they always
Yeah.
almost because it's in December and they pick the year that's already complete, which is the year before that. And I
Yeah.
think that's not timely enough, right? So I want to
Yeah.
see what's the best paper this year, not whatever, what's online now. So I know what you
Yeah.
mean. Like it's hard to find and it doesn't matter too much. I think like who cares
Yeah.
whether it's online, advanced, past here.
Well, we ended up not doing it. Right. We ended up picking one that we said, all right, we'll put that one in next year's. But yeah.
So you brought up qualitative meta-analysis. You worked on your 2019 qualitative meta-analysis in 2008. That's amazing. That's 11 years. I didn't know that it was your PhD work. What I do know
Yeah.
about this paper is when it came out, I think I came up this year and said, like, what's a qualitative meta-analysis? That doesn't exist. A meta-analysis is a statistical technique. And it took until this year, in February, right? In February this
Huh.
year, when I was in Georgia, you came down and you gave a PhD class on qualitative meta-analysis. And I sat in and I did the reading. I was a really good student. And, I learned. I learned about qualitative meta-analysis. It's really cool. And to be honest, I've never heard about it.
And it was so funny this session because at the beginning, so this is in the short form how the session went. Okay, I'm going to do qualitative meta analysis. Wrecker, you're here. Yeah. And qualitative meta analysis is bullshit. And then we talked for
You
2 hours or
wrote that
whatever.
you wrote that on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
Qualitative meta-analysis is bullshit.
Yeah. Wrecker's opinion, bullshit. So we put that up. And then the idea was at the end of the session, will Wrecker still say it's bullshit? And you said, no, it's not.
No,
So you
it's
started
very
with it's
legit. Yeah, it's
bullshit
very cool.
by the end.
Hmm.
Now, some of that might have been theater. Hopefully, you didn't actually think it was bullshit at the time. But
No,
maybe you
no,
did.
no, no. But I seriously hadn't really heard of it. I've seen your paper, of course, but I really thought you just flipped the idea of a meta-analysis a little bit because now I know that you actually took this methodology from a book, etc. So I
Yeah.
really didn't know that it existed.
Yeah, my dissertation, I actually innovated it in my dissertation because I was doing it on enterprise systems, and as you've mentioned many times, there are a million studies on enterprise systems. So I had a particular view, but you have to review the literature in such a way that your particular view clearly has a. But you know what? A lot of the literature are these qualitative papers. And the problem with qualitative papers is that one will give you this really rich story, and then they'll conclude with something about power. They'll say manager versus people, worker power, right? And then another paper will tell you a really similar story, but they'll conclude with something about whatever socio-materiality and ensembles and what, right? Then another paper will tell you a very similar story, and give you some argument about, say, institutional alignment and misalignment, right? So the stories in the data, all these qualitative papers that are coming out, interpretive, the ethnographies, whatever, they're telling stories about ERP, but they're using different theoretical lenses. And
Yeah.
I kind of was like, well, I don't want to look at their theoretical lens in a sense. I want to see what their data is saying, and I want to compile this to see if things are agreeing. And this was one of the exercises during my dissertation. And I'm like, all right, how do I do this? And I was already starting to do the task when I discovered the Noblet and Hare's book. It's 1988. And they're, I think, educational researchers, or at least one of
Yeah.
the two is. One might be a sociologist, the other's an educational researcher. And, they were looking at schools and that sort of thing, and looking at each school to see what works in that school. And they're seeing that there are a bunch of, and they were ethnographers, right? So to them, they called it a meta ethnography. And they're like, well, one ethnography, but we can compile all these ethnographies as data, and we can draw our own conclusions. So that's what I used as kind of the language. And yeah, the idea is that in qualitative data, like any data, any complex inductive situation, this is the underdetermination problem. This is Quine had this underdetermination problem and what Quine said was that any given data set in the world, you can draw an infinite number of equally acceptable uh, conclusions, right? So that's what Quine said, the famous philosopher. People since have said, well, they're not all equally valid, but you can draw more than one valid conclusion from the same data.
Yeah.
And that's the case. So that's what qualitative researchers are doing. They're looking at cases that are often very similar to each other, but they're drawing much different valid conclusions. So whereas a typical lit review reviews their conclusions, we ignore their conclusions and look
And
right
look
at
at the
their
data.
data,
Yeah.
which
I
is
like it
what a
very much.
quantitative meta-analysis does too, right? We're not looking at
Exactly. But
we're looking at, yeah.
you know how we talked once about meta-analysis. We made the point that we don't see a lot of meta-analysis in IAS because we don't have it's not a high paradigm field, right? So I know there's a meta-analysis of TAM research. There's one on trust, I believe. There we gave one of our awards to Samzaza, IT turnover and professional turnover intention, stuff like this. But it's really just a handful. Now I'm thinking the qualitative meta-analysis. That's more something, right? Because we do have many cases about, firms' digital transformation, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a gazillion of them. There's one in healthcare, there's one in education, there's one in banking, there's a bunch in service, in whatever, right? So this could be a really powerful tool for us to review our, cumulative knowledge tradition a bit better. Because, that I've been
Yeah.
saying a lot. I think I said it last year. It would be good to say that take stock. We're 50 years old. What do we
Mm-hmm.
know? Like
Yeah.
I am actually a fan. That's the paradox, I think. I don't like seeing literature reviews, but I'm actually a fan of literature reviews because they're so valuable. They're so helpful. If someone
Yeah.
just says, this is what we know, this is what it means, and
Yeah.
this is
That's
what we
the,
still need to know and stuff like this, right? So I
yeah.
do think that everyone hates seeing them as a reviewer or editor, but I actually would like to see more than we have.
Well, and all right. So, I've been pushing on this podcast this new genre of computationally intensive theory construction. Well, what is that? You're taking a bunch of data and you're generating a new interpretation of that bunch of data. So what do you do with a qualitative meta-analysis? In a given domain, a whole bunch of people have written qualitative case studies. You're generating an original kind of theory construction from that. So to me, it's the same thing. And it was really my first start in thinking about it. And just to go back to that paper, I just want to kind of close the loop because it's kind of a fun story. Andrew Burton Jones was the editor of the track at ISIS when I submitted that paper and it went to ISIS, and he really liked it. And then he was a senior editor at MIS Quarterly many years later, and I was focused on getting the empirical stuff out of my dissertation. And usually you
Yeah.
don't publish the like review of the literature part. So I kept thinking one day I might publish it, whatever. Years went by. I got a couple papers published from my dissertation. Andrew was a senior editor at MIS Quarterly in like 2015 or something.
Yeah.
And he said, Nick, I remember you had this ISIS paper. Whatever happened to that? That was really
So he
interesting.
came to you?
He asked me, is that the greatest dude in the world? He asked me, he goes, whatever happened with that? And I go, well, do you want it at MIS Quarterly? He goes, well, if you send it to me, I'll send it out to review it. So he actually
That
brought it
I
up to
think
me.
that's what editors should be doing. We talked
Yeah,
about
they
this
should.
before, right? And Marshak does
Yeah.
that as well, I believe. She runs around,
Yeah.
it's like, send it to me, send it to me. I'm trying to do
Yeah.
that as well. If when I see a really good one, it's like,
Yeah.
what are you doing with this paper? Come on,
Send it to me.
send it to me,
Yeah.
send it to me, right? So I think that's great. It's a great story. It's what everyone should be
Yeah.
doing. Yeah,
Yeah, so many years. So it published a decade later. I had to update everything.
yeah.
But here's an interesting thing. I was at. This is the problem with asking people to send it to you. Last week, I was at the Kin, the
Summer school.
EU in Amsterdam. Marlene Hoosman and Hans Behrens and that whole group, right? Wonderful summer school. It's an institution at this point in IS, right? Every summer.
I agree. It's
And
very,
I
very
asked her,
good.
too. Afterwards, I'm like, thank you for inviting me. And she looks at me and she's like, I didn't invite you. I'm like, what do you mean you didn't invite me?
You just showed up.
Yeah. No, she said, you invited yourself. I'm like, what? And apparently at like a conference a year ago or AOM, I'm like, when am I going to be invited? So she felt bad and had to invite me. Apparently I
That is
pressured her
amazing
to,
because I'll use this podcast here because I looked at the today like because one of my students was there and one other girl that I work with anyway and they talk everyone talks very highly of the event, right? So some of my
Mhm.
students have been there previously. It's fantastic, as you said. It's a really good institution in IS in digital innovation. It's great, and I said that today. It's like why am I never asked?
Yeah. Ask Marlene. Tell Marlene you're doing it next year.
I just
Yeah.
invited myself to
There you
come to
go.
Amsterdam. I'll take the bloody train. It's like
Yeah.
$50. I'll be there.
Do it. Yeah. But here I am as an editor at the place. Literally everything that the young people were doing, I'm like, yeah, send it to me at MISQ. So I'm going to have a bunch of papers at MISQ now, which I probably won't even get assigned to me. Yeah.
But tell me this, like, so whenever I go to some of these events, I usually go out and tell all these young, I say like everything you're doing is amazing in comparison to what everyone was doing 20 years ago. Don't you
Oh yeah,
agree? This
yeah.
is
Oh,
cool topics.
absolutely.
I saw yesterday or something. There's a new paper in ISR on technology and conspiracy by like another young German Simon Trang, I think. And I was like,
Yeah,
man, what a great idea! Like it's a great idea.
yeah,
It's a great paper, of course, and it's an ISR. It's fantastic. Everything's fantastic, and
yeah,
it's great. Yeah, it's great topics. They're really interesting. I literally looked at it, downloaded, read it in the minute I saw it because it's so amazing. It's so interesting. And
yeah.
that's I can't say the same thing about, oh my God, there's another TAM paper in 2002.
No,
That just wasn't the
no.
case. It wasn't as
No,
interesting.
and I think it's because we've moved from the IT function, which if you look at like the 90s, it was all about the kind of the IT function. And my work in enterprise systems was all about IT oriented. So, I mean, I thought it was organizational side, but it really, who's interested in enterprise systems? IT
Yeah,
people, right?
yeah,
And then
yeah.
what's happened in the last decade? Well, there's the big data thing, which everyone's interested in, but it's AI, blockchain, all these cool technologies that aren't necessarily the IT function anymore, but
And
they're,
there are also more interesting dependent variables, right? I mean, the
yeah,
dependent variable has changed. Not only the technology is the independent variable. It's not only
yeah,
value or return on investment or alignment in implementation or something like this. No, now it's about number of conspiracies. That's a
yeah,
great dependent variable, or
yeah,
likelihood or to fall for them or whatever, right? Or like chances of political a reorientation. There's some really cool, very important dependent variable on the board. Much better, for
yeah,
example, than my hate field, like marketing, willingness to buy,
yeah,
conversion rate.
yeah.
Like,
That's less fun.
no, it's important. I get it, but I'm very happy that we have a wider array of dependent variables than they do. I really am.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back to kind of reviews and there's that qualitative meta-analysis which you kindly you like now. You don't think it's bullshit anymore, and it's a good
Mm,
way to look at a bunch of case studies without necessarily doing them yourself in
yeah.
an area. And I did one on enterprise system implementation. I did another one on escalation research, right? Where so those are published, and I've actually been talking to people, and perhaps I'll do another one at some point with some folks. But that's one way of taking what we know in the literature and starting to, and this is less about, and meta-analyses are less about what we know and what we found, more about taking the substance, right? In a quantitative meta-analysis, it's taking the data itself, right? And reanalyzing it in your, right? Reconciling different measures with each other so that you can kind of aggregate across the findings, not their framing, not their conclusions, but you're actually taking their data and you're reconciling the data with each other, and then you're drawing conclusions with essentially a higher sample than taking
Absolutely.
just one. So it's the same intuition, I think, with my formulation of a qualitative meta-analysis. There's some guys in JAIS, and we can post the it's Ryan Nelson and some other folks where they looked at a few different types of qualitative aggregation, right? You basically go from just doing a lit review all the way to like a, meta-ethnography kind of approach.
Yeah, and folks, the background to this is that a couple of episodes back we had JVB on, and one of the things he's known for many things, but one of them is this idea of a structured systematic literature review, and it's enormously popular, but it also drew a lot of criticism for a way or for becoming such a popular like popular in the sense of many people doing it way of reviewing the literature, following, basically a very simple, clear process model, filtering for abstract, and it drew a lot of criticism. And you and I, we have both criticized it. So I guess the point for today was not so much to discourage people from doing this, but also show like there's many ways of reviewing the literature. And to me, it all depends on what do you want to do? Like, what's your objective here? What's your goal? Why are you reviewing the literature? And then I'll tell you how to do it. Right. So structured literature review is one way. And to be very clear, the one thing I really hate about what people do with this approach is they use it as a shortcut to avoid reading the goddamn paper. Right. So I
Yeah, I
really
think you're
think that's
right.
what they happen. Like they're
Yeah.
doing all these title keyword
No,
abstract search,
yeah.
and then they're not reading. Yeah. And I think that is the fundamental mistake. So put it the other way. If you want to review the literature, you have to read. There's no other way around it. Right. So I don't know how else to do it. I can't have a tool do it for me. I can't have AI summarize it for me because, like I need to read it. If you don't like that, then you're in the wrong profession. I'm sorry. Right. Is that
Yeah.
fair to say?
I think you're right. I know you're right. That's absolutely. And here's my problem. So we were joking when JVB was on board. Uh,
That he's
do
done
you
a
hear that?
disservice to the field. No,
Yeah, and it's because we keep getting these structured lit review papers. Now, I read his little conference paper and I read the CAIS that he came up with
yeah,
afterwards, right? And I actually don't have much of a problem with what he wrote. I think
me
what the
neither.
problem is with, well, all right, there are two things. The first is that it's about reviewing the literature. All right, so let's think about what that means. That there is a literature, and now I want to understand what it says. So, who reviews the literature in this way? Well, it's someone who doesn't know the literature. It's a new PhD student, and I want to capture a domain. So, I'm going to use this approach to capture the knowledge in the domain. That's kind of uh, I don't know. It's either very high paradigm. So it's like we all have the same theory, we all have the same, right? And I'm just trying to figure out what everyone has done, right? So let's say it's a medical journal and I want to aggregate our knowledge in a particular thing. So I want to make sure I capture all the knowledge that's out there about that thing. All right. That's maybe the paradigm that you're drawing from if you're going to do an exhaustive search of the
Yeah,
literature. The problem is that's not what we do, right? We don't have a high paradigm. There's a phenomenon, and then there are different theories with the phenomenon, and there are different conclusions. The phenomenon is not one thing. Like, think about anything we talk about, whether it's AI. AI is just a type of IT. Blockchain is a type of database, right? These phenomena are not distinct. So if I'm going to do a exhaustive lit review of blockchain, I'm not really doing an exhaustive lit review of blockchain, am I? Because if blockchain is an instance of the broader category of data, right, then I'd have to go back to whatever, World War II and since, to talk about how we're going to, and then I would have to survey everything we know about data and then distributed data and then the instance of blockchain. And then it's like these phenomenon driven lit reviews don't make sense that they're exhaustive. So you have to come up with kind of boundary conditions, and the boundary conditions saying that it's the current phenomenon. It's like, let's say you're going to do a structured one on digital twins or something. You'll end up with a very weak review of just what people saying about digital twins. You're not actually getting at the substance of what we know about, digital technologies representing and mirroring physical realities, right? To do that, you'd have to go look at representation theory. To do that, you have to go look at Bungie to go, right? So these
Punchy.
phenomenon
Bullet.
based
Yeah.
Bunga, whatever his name is. So these phenomenon-based structured lit reviews, I think, make no sense. Now, if you're doing a theory-oriented structured lit review, like the one you did with representation theory, that makes sense because now you're saying, here's a community, it's the IS community, here's a theory, representation theory. Now, how has it been used and what do we know? All right,
Yeah.
to me, that makes sense. But to say blockchain, now let's do a lit review. Well, no, there's like a bunch of different fields. It's like,
I agree.
where do you draw the
I'll
line of
give
the
you.
phenomenon?
I fully agree with you, and I'll give you another one. The again, and let's be very clear about this. I also don't think there's anything wrong with the ESIS paper or the CIS paper. In fact, they're quite nice, both of them. Again, so the paper in that, like the how people apply it, I think that has a couple of issues. So one of the ways in which it is being applied, either one of the two papers, is as a justification for people to do a search across the basket of 8 or 10 or 11 papers, right? So they sort of like they refer to the paper, which actually doesn't say that, but they say like, look, based on this, we follow this methodology and we limit our search to the basket of 8 because that's IS. Well, first of all, it's not. That's not the IS field. This is just a subset. Second, IS, our field doesn't have boundaries. Like we are by definition cross-sectional. Like, so if you do anything in our field, everything people do in business is relevant. In fact, anything people do in social science is relevant, and everything that people do in relation to IT. All the engineering stuff is relevant. All the computer science stuff is relevant. All the software engineering stuff is relevant. So if you're not doing this, you're literally not covering what has been done. It's ridiculous,
Yeah.
right? So AI, there's a gazillion research on AI from within computer science all the way to sociology, philosophy, everywhere. So what
Yeah.
point is there of saying like I look at the European journal and the JIT and the JSIS? It's just no, you're not getting anywhere, right? Your
Yeah.
job is not to write a paper about what our 6 journals say or don't say. Your job
Yeah.
is to create knowledge and to understand that knowledge we already have,
Yeah.
right? So it's
So
it's it's not a good idea. It's
I
wrong.
agree 100%. And that's the issue of this structured lit review, right? That
Exactly.
that you come up with a word that you like, digital twin, blockchain, pick the phenomenon, and then you do a literature review of that word in IS. So that's the first thing you do. So I think it's just premised on the wrong idea. But then the second thing is what do you say? You critique IS and you say, look, these groups, these folks look at this, these folks look at this, and they should be looking. And then what's your big conclusion? Well, that the literature should be looking at other things, or it needs more work in certain areas. It's like, that's not a contribution. That's just, that's the start. That's the very beginning of starting to do research on digital twins or blockchain, would be doing a lit review, thinking about what research literature needs, then go freaking do it, right?
Yeah.
Don't write a paper to us telling us what it needs. So that's the thing that I get sometimes, especially at conferences, is this critical structured lit review. It's like, oh, now I'm going to criticize the literature. So not only did I come up with some small subset, phenomenon oriented, supposedly exhaustive of just IS, but now what I'm going to do is criticize it, which usually means pointing out things it doesn't do. It doesn't do this, it doesn't do this. And it's like, so,
Yeah.
and then they cite JVB. Now, I think in part it might be JVB's fault. And if you go look at, and I'm looking at the CAIS paper, and under method perspective, what he does is says there are two kinds of reviews. There's the narrative review and the systematic review. And I guess what I'm basically, and he says the narrative review is sometimes called conventional literature, right? So I think this is the problem. And you tell me if I'm right. I think the only kind of lit review we should be doing in IS is narrative review. And if we're going to do a structured lit review, the only time we should do it is if theory, not phenomenon oriented structured lit review, but
I like
theory
that.
oriented structured
I
lit
like that.
reviews.
Because in a way, that's what you said about you mentioned our representation reviews. And I mentioned this a couple of times on air in a bunch of episodes. In fact, there's multiple reviews, right? We didn't write a review, we wrote two. And there's a third one, again, using a different method. So, in fact, on the same body, there's a narrative review, there is a meta-analysis, and there is a framework or an integrative review where we reinterpret the literature. All right, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of is a success or failure. That's the framing we use. So we reinterpreted it. We did straight up narrative review, and Sagafi and Yair they did a straight up statistical meta analysis. Well, they're slightly different subsets. The big difference, and here's the big difference, is really on the ground how we did it. Now we started with a theory, and the theory was published in a paper. And in fact,
Right.
it was published in 1987 or something, right? So what
Right.
we did, our starting point, we went to the 1987 paper on Google Scholar and said, like, tell me all the citing papers. And I can't
Mm-hmm.
remember. I think it was at that time it was about 1100, right?
Okay.
And we there's basically three main early papers, late 80s. And we cross-read
Mm-hmm.
them. There were about 800 or so papers citing these three papers.
Right.
We downloaded every single one of them. I think 5 of them were in French or something, so we didn't read them.
Hmm.
But all the other 795 we read.
Uh,
And we know that is the literature that deals with the theory because all of them refer to this, to the
yeah.
main bodies. Then we did
But
some
half of them were just superficial references, right?
yeah,
They
of
weren't
course, right.
really.
But we read them to figure that out, right? So first you had to read them, and then we dropped depending on the type of review we did, we dropped about a half of them because they were sort of like in the conclusion. It said, oh, by the way, there's also representation theory side here, right? Not all of them were substantive citations. But the only way to figure that out, the point was that we started with every single paper that we could reasonably expect to actually work with this theory, and then we read all of them. Took a year.
Yeah.
It took
Yeah.
a year. How far, like even for fast readers, it's 800 papers. I still have them. It's a
Yeah.
gigantic database. And by the way, also another common mistake. No, I didn't give it to a student to read. Like what? Like
Yeah.
a assistant or something? Like how the hell is that going to help you do your literature review? You need
Yeah.
to know the literature. Not your,
Yeah.
in the end of the day, your student knows the literature, but you
Yeah.
don't. What the hell? That's not how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of these things you have to do yourself.
Yep. So I think that that's the problem is we need a narrative understanding of phenomena, but then we do this structured lit review of phenomena, which is like now. With that said, I'm thinking of like digital transformation. What if you did a review of everything we know about digital transformation? Well, first of all, that would be huge, but it is a phenomenon in a sense, and I think we do need someone at some point to give
I
us a
agree. I fully
summary
agree.
of what we actually know. Like I want to review what we already know about digital transformation. Let's say you want to write that paper. How do you do it? How do you?
Well, first of all, I would the first thing is I would try to do this qualitative meta-analysis. I would try to find, I'm pretty sure you could find 100, 200 reasonably good cases, rich cases, where you have enough data in there that you could do this qualitative meta-analysis as you just explained to me. Forget their conclusion interpretation, go straight back to the data and then re-earn it. The other one you could do, which is now what I'm actually trying to do, not on digital transformation, but is what people call an integrative review. The integrative review is the type of review you see in AOM Annals. You know, the literature review
yeah,
journal that they
yeah,
have, AOM Annals. The types of reviews you publish there, they're not structured, they're not narrative, they're not meta-analysis, they're integrative. And what that means is they basically say, like, these are the things that are being discussed by different conversions. And I'm integrating all of this to do one or two things. Either I'm trying to do an adjudication, I'm trying to create a verdict, or I'm
yeah.
trying to reorient,
So I'm thinking
right?
of some of the Annals papers. I know Paul Leonardi has one, and
Yeah,
I've read a
or
bunch of these. They're all beautiful, but that's the difference. There's a structure going on there, but I think it's a narrative review is what they're doing. They tell a story in every one of these papers. It's like his paper is like, here's the way that we thought about it here. Then there's this other way of thinking about it. Then and he builds it up and then there's this final way.
well, you could call it a type of narrative review. I think there's a very nice, very recent editorial, I guess, or a method paper on this type of review that and it's written by the editors of the AOM Annals, Matthew Cronin and Elizabeth George, which is cool because it's one of my favorite book authors, Elizabeth George. It's an
Mm-hmm.
American writing English crime novels, but I don't think it's her.
Mm.
Anyway, so that's a very nice paper where they talk about this type of review. And I think the difference to a narrative review, it's actually more conversation based. It's about who are my conversants, which are the
Yeah.
communities that are formed, and how do they talk about this broad phenomenon, say digital transformation. So the
Yeah.
integrative review goes beyond paradigms, metaphors, schools of thoughts,
Yeah.
and just tries to integrate all of them together, right? And
And it's
says like, look,
organizing. So I guess that's the key that I would take away from what you're saying. And the reviews that I like are organizing based on conversations. It's not as if there's like just a table saying they say this, they say this. It's more like, all right, here's a conversation. And this is what the conclusions are from this conversation. Here's another
exactly.
conversation that emphasizes different aspects of it. Here are the conclusions from that other conversation.
And this is really nice because what it does, this type of review, you can only do, first of all, if you really know the conversations and if you really know what individual scholars say about
Mm-hmm.
a particular phenomenon. Second,
Yeah.
the scope of these reviews is big. You mentioned
Yeah.
Paul Leonardi, Emma Vast. They did this integrated review of social media. Like,
Yeah.
woof. There's a lot of stuff that people talked about in social media, right? And they integrate all of that. There's, of course, Wanda Olikovsky, very famous social materiality. That's another one of these, like technology and organizing. Like, how broad can you possibly be, right? So if you have a topic like this, then, and if you really know the literature, like you really know the points and the arguments that individual scholars make, then I think you can do an integrated
And
review.
you know why? Here's why, Wrecker. Because it's not a list. The moment whatever you're doing turns into a laundry list, you're probably doing the wrong thing. If you're telling an integrative story based on tons of knowledge, now you have the laundry list on your computer, right? There's clearly a list somewhere of a bunch of papers, and then you've organized them in some way. But the thing you write is a story,
Yeah,
right? If what you're publishing starts looking like a laundry list, I think that's a problem. And I guess that's my issue with a lot of these structured lit reviews. The
fully agree.
basis upon which they use inclusion criteria, right, and that they do their review uh, is a problem. And then they have these laundry lists, and then they're critical. They're like, and then their conclusion is the gap, which is awful. It's like, oh, and we're not doing this other thing that we should be doing. Well, why don't you go do it? You know?
Yeah. Just two more examples of this, right? So again, integrated review. Nicholas Foss, famous guy, he wrote an
Mm-hmm.
integrated review on microfoundation. That's a huge topic area, right? There's another one on, like on
But it's a
dynamic
theory.
capabilities. Yeah,
It's a
but
theory. Yeah.
it's a huge conversation. In this particular case, a theoretical conversation where
Yeah.
lots of people say different lots of things. And the key point here is the same with the laundry list argument is not every paper, not every viewpoint, not every argument is equal. And you
Right.
got to work that out, right? And again,
Yeah.
you can only do this if you already master the field. I don't think you could do this type of review saying like, I'm going to do it and now I start reading. No, you can write such a paper after you've been working in this field and you know what the conversation have been for the last 10, 20 years or something like
Yeah.
that, right? So
Here-
again,
yeah.
it's probably a good reason why there's old senior scholars writing these types of reviews. It's very difficult for a PhD student to have that handle of these conversations. And it's
Yeah.
more than just knowing that there's 27 papers on blockchain,
Yeah. And it's funny. You need here's one thing that I think a lot of especially younger researchers don't realize. They think we're in a game where what you can do is knock out a bunch of papers and you can have a superficial understanding of a few different things and continue to knock out these papers and just keep your superficial understanding. And the problem is that works for some people for some time, maybe. Um, but that's not the way to be a scholar. That's not the way to have a career. Like I
It's
see
also
what we're
not the
doing.
point of this profession. The point of this
Yeah.
profession is not to write papers.
The
It's
point of
not.
this profession is to
It's to
do
create knowledge.
scholarship. Well, and I see it with you. I never really paid much attention to representation theory. We're talking about that one, and then we are working with you now with some colleagues. You and I are on a research project, and you're our representation theory, which is becoming kind of the main theory of our paper. And you're the expert. You don't need, like, I read this stuff. I'm not sure you know this stuff inside and out. You know its history. You know
Well,
where it
thank
came
you.
from. Right? It's like there's a handful of people in IS who are experts. Like they know this shit. about representation theory fundamentally, right? Uh, I would say that's what you want to be if you're doing this research endeavor. It's not about doing a structured lit review, dismissing something, then moving on to your next structured lit review. And oh, if you happen to do the first structured lit review in, I don't know, some a good journal, but maybe not the elite journals, but it's the first one on a particular topic, then you get a million citations, even if you do a bad job, right? So it's like then people are racing to do the first structured lit review. This is that clickbait stuff, right? So that they can get their million citations. That's not your goal as a scholar. Your goal as a scholar is to know something and be one of the top, just like you with representation theory. There's probably five, maybe
There's
six
probably
people.
five. Yeah, Jeff, Roman, Andrew, Ron, of course. That's about it,
Yeah.
and maybe
So that's
myself.
it. In our little corner of the world, which is information systems research, there's whatever 4,000 researchers. Of those 4,000 researchers, there are five legit experts, maybe eight. Maybe there's some junior ones you're not paying attention to.
Yeah.
There's like eight, maybe there's 10 legit experts who know representation theory fundamentally. I think it's your job as a scholar, as when you're writing a dissertation, when you're taking your dissertation and you're writing papers from it, to be one of those 5 to 10 people in your niche of the world. And if you're not, you're probably not going to achieve at the level of Jan Recker, right? You're not going to be in the top journals. You're not going to have a career where you have multiple papers in a stream. What you'll be is one of these people who, mishmashes. Every paper's new. You're learning the literature brand new for each paper, and my institutional theory stuff, it's what I presented in Amsterdam. It's still relevant to this day. It was relevant when I did my dissertation. It's going to be relevant when you and I retire,
And of
right?
course, everything you said about me is the same for you, right? So I know you with your institutional theory, and we also work on a project where you are the expert, bring you in for this, and you know this too, right? And again, how many of these people are there? Maybe 10. Like
Yeah.
it gets very lonely there. So I want to talk just a few helpful hits for people that get started, right? It's easy for us to sit here and say like, hey, integrated review, you can't do that as a student, and you shouldn't do a structured review either because it's bad. So what can you do? So what I one of the paper I truly love, and I go back to it all the time, is actually a review, a paper about how to do literature reviews by Guy Paré and others. Yeah, Guy Paré
Okay.
from SGC in Montreal. He's done a
Yeah.
few papers on how to do literature reviews. I think he handled the review section at JS for a while. Anyway, so he has a paper in INM of all places called the typology of literary reviews.
Oh, cool. I don't even know this paper.
It's
Yeah.
fantastic, people, because what it is in the middle of this paper, you only have to go to one page where there's a table, and it says like, here's 10 types of literature reviews. Here's the goal. Here's the type of review. And here's what you need to do. It's fantastic, right? I'll use it all the time when I talk with students. It's like, okay, you want to read it? All right, what are we trying here? What is our goal? Okay, well, then we need to do a scoping or narrative or a theoretical or critical or meta-analysis, whatever, or a scoping review. That's the type. And then these are the guidelines that pertain to this type.
Yeah.
It's really useful just to understand the different types. It's super
Yeah.
cool.
And I think that of these, I'm just looking at that table. First of all, I'm going to read this, and this sounds awesome. But I'll tell you this, I guess, and this is what I would do is my bias as someone who has to deal with people doing reviews. I'd be like, if you're going to send me a descriptive review, you have to have a point, right? I'm going to reject your descriptive review. I'm going to reject your critical review unless you're saying something, right? I'm going to reject probably half of these reviews,
Oh, of course you
at
will,
least the
but this
ones
is
that I get,
because the
right?
goals are not all equal, right?
Yeah.
They're not,
Yeah.
right? So he talks about in this table that we're looking at right now. He has four goals: summarize the literature, aggregate or integrate the literature, build new explanations, or critically assess the literature. I
Yeah.
would completely agree with you, but this is from your vantage point of what gets published in the quarterly. This is, that may or may not be
Right.
a goal, right?
Yeah.
So it's still, of course, for some, like I just published a scoping review last year with my student in her first year. We scoped the literature and AI development. What do we know and what do we not know? It's simple
Yeah.
about a developing AI system as opposed to standard information system. AI development
Right.
versus AI development. Woof. Scoping review. Well, we're not even going to submit that to the quarterly. No, but
No.
we still
Yeah.
did it.
Good
Like
point.
we wanted to do this, and it was a good point to summarize that. And because we were
Yeah.
doing it anyway, we wrote a little paper about it. But no, that's not going to appear in ISAR or something, right?
Yeah, and I'm being a little critical because if you're a second year PhD student, you pick an area of your dissertation, understanding the literature in a structured way makes sense. And if you write it up, that excuse me, and that makes sense. And then if you send it to a conference, it'll get you into the conference, you present. Uh, you won't get an MIS quarterly. That's like the basis upon which you're going to do your real work that will get you an MIS quarterly. But you can send it to another journal and
Absolutely,
get
right?
in, right? Yeah. So I'm being too negative, aren't I?
You're not negative. You're just, but you're only, you being American. Everything that's not in these two journals doesn't exist in your world. The other paper that I actually think is kind of helpful is Suzanne Rivar. She was
Mm,
the theory and reviews editor for what, people in the day. Suzanne Rivar, she handled the theory and review section for the quarterly, irrespective of what the theory and review was about. So she handled all theory and review paper. Now they changed that. Now, if it's about institutional theory and it's a theory review, it goes to Nick. Representative would go to me. So now every editor's about a topic area could also get a theory and review. But back in the day, it was different. So our theory and review paper, my first, was handled by Suzanne because she was the handling editor. Anyway, so at some stage, she wrote an editorial. It's called Ions of Theory Construction, and where she talks about what's the difference between a literature review and a theory generating a review, like a theory paper, a theory
yeah.
development paper, right? Because the,
Yeah.
the 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 section in the quarterly is misleading. They don't want reviews. What they want is new theories,
Yeah.
right? And that's helpful for people just to find two, three, four characteristics, understand what is the difference here. Like you
Yeah.
can't, can't do a summarizing scoping review and send it to the section. That's not what they're looking for. What
Well,
they're
and you have
looking
to link to
for,
our podcast with Dorothy Leidner from last year,
exactly,
right?
right?
Because she had that
Exactly.
whatever what the literature says, what they found, and what it means. So she had a distinction. So if people are interested in doing strong lit reviews, uh, but even what you just said, quarterly, if they're doing institutional theory review, they'll send it to me. If they're doing a representation theory review, they'd send it to you. What if they're doing I don't know, digital transformation review? They'd send it to either of us, right?
They probably send it to you.
Pick some. Well, yeah, but pick something, right? If you go phenomenon, then it's all of a sudden it might not have a home actually, so it would just go to whatever generalist editor is
Well,
there.
they go to generalist editors, I think, but they also go to editors that have experience in writing these types of papers. So I'm actually handling a few theory and review papers at the
Mm-hmm.
moment. I think three. I can think of three at the moment that I'm handling, and it's probably because I've published two or three
Yeah,
myself, right? So
yeah,
I think that also comes into the and I pick an AE that has written theoretical papers as well.
yeah,
Like
mm,
like Ping Wan, right? So Ping,
yeah,
he's a great guy, and he's written theory papers. So I
yeah,
sometimes use him as an AE for theoretical papers because I'm like, hey,
yeah,
it works.
yep,
So
yeah.
the
He's
other thing
good.
I wanted to say towards the end here, and I've said this before, and tell me what you think of this. You know that as something I write and then I read, literally in this order. So the
Yeah,
weird thing for me is that the paradoxical situation is I read the most when I'm writing. And I think it's because I write differently. I see many people, and I would place you there or Brian, some of the co-authors I work with, they write and they include these placeholders for references that they actually insert later.
mm-hmm.
They write their argument, they write their paragraph, and then later on, when we buy the argument, we actually find the nice references. Now I do it differently. So I write a sentence, and then I'm looking at the reference and I read it. And as I'm
Mm-hmm.
reading it, I notice that I have to go to this other thing. And then I'm reading that. So I'm actually reading a lot when I'm writing. Now, no one gets to see that. But that's also why when I send my draft version, usually after every sentence, you see the two, three references because that's the outcome of my reading process. So I'm
Yeah.
reading a lot only when I'm writing. I don't sit down like you. You always say that you read first because you don't know what to write. I write
Yeah.
first because I don't know what to read.
Well, and
You
that's
know
the
what I
difference.
mean?
So one comes from and one comes from expertise and one comes from learning as you're going, right?
Of course, in
So
representation theory, I don't, right? I know what
yeah,
I
yeah,
just write and then put in the reference because I
yeah,
know them by heart. But in other
yeah.
areas, I don't.
So this is so if, for example, that paper when I'm doing the institutional section, I might just leave placeholders because I'm not sure. Because here's the deal: you make a particular claim, there are probably 5, 8 papers that you could potentially put after the claim. but you don't want to use different papers for each claim. You need to really pick the conversation. So you just have placeholders while you tell your story. Once you figure out where your story is and where those critical, not just they said something, but it's a key point of their paper, and you have that later in your paper, you can bring those up towards the front, right? So yeah, I think if you have a mastery of the literature, the references don't matter as much. You'll stick a reference here and there that is the appropriate reference for your paper. Uh, but yeah, for me, it's all about reading, and it's all about understanding what you want to say, and how you want to say it, and how you're going to use the literature to make your point. I don't. So this is one thing, and this is the Watson and Weber, or Weber and Watson, Webster and Watson.
Webster and
What was
Watson,
Webster
2002.
and Watson,
Yeah.
right? And they had this distinction, and this was a very important distinction for me when you're doing the lit review of a paper. Uh, they had a distinction, and I forget what it was, but it was two types of. They said you're
It's
either going to have a
author-centric and concept-centric, wasn't it?
yes,
Or
that's it, yeah,
paper-centric and concept-centric. Yeah.
exactly. So paper centric has this view of, okay, now I'm going to report to you from the literature. So if like I'm doing an experiment in psychology and it's a high paradigm thing, and it's like, all right, this one that found this, or this one found this one, now this is what I found, right? That's like medicine. That's like psychology, right? It's those kind of experimentalist hypothesis, incremental, well-defined high paradigm space. So then you can have a paper-centric review. For us, or at least the genres that I generally play in, which is theory heavy, that doesn't help much very
No.
often.
Yeah.
Paper centric reviews. Instead, it's all about rhetorical moves and how you're positioning yourself with respect to authors. For every paper centric saying, Recker et al. Said such and such, you need to set that up with 12 conceptually oriented like sentences that have the pulling an argument together. So I think that idea of conceptually structured lit reviews is, I don't know, to me the key of setting up a lit
It is the
review. And
key.
in there you can have like two or three author centric
Exactly.
references.
Let me make that very practical, because again, this is one of the things we did in our theme review, the 2017 representation review. Like, people think of it as, normally when people do a literature review, they build an Excel spreadsheet and every row is a paper, right? So it'd be
Yeah,
record all, Beren all, blah, blah, blah. And then, and then the columns are the things that they code for, or, whatever. Now the concept centric, it flips that. Yeah.
yeah,
So you have on the rows are concepts, and the columns are maybe papers, right? And in
yeah,
our review paper, you actually see this in the appendix, I think, if I remember correctly. We have the
yeah,
actual concept matrices that we build from these, God knows how many papers there were, and they organized by concept. Yeah,
yeah,
the rows are concepts. The rows are not papers. And then in the
yeah,
columns, we have a bunch of papers that deal with a particular concept, right?
yeah,
So, if you think about your Excel table and flip it by 90 degrees. That's the
yeah.
difference.
And my argument is, if you want to write a compelling,
Yeah.
interesting argument, it's understand those concepts fundamentally, understand the relevant relationships those concepts have to other concepts, and then you have the front end to a contribution to literature. If it's all about what people are doing, then you're not disciplined in a way that will make it
Yeah.
obvious what your contribution
And the
is.
only doable way, which is something you said earlier, and the only way to get at this really is if you pick a topic area, say a theory or a phenomena, and stick with it.
Yeah.
Right? Right? Because otherwise it just gets too much work. You can't do this for 20 different things.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and for me, I have to say it's theory. And I know I always err on the side of theory, and I know I have a bias, but I don't know too many people who have really made a career, and we respect them. And I guess I'm putting my scholarly blinders on, because I guess if you go to uh, computer science and other places, there are people who pick a technology and made an entire career about the technology,
Yeah.
right? And there
Bloody
are a
hell
few
they
of
have.
those in IS as well. But to me, at least in the top journals, in information systems and an organizational side, right, which is where my the concept, right, the theory, the conceptual understanding of the domain and similar domains is what I think enables people to just be hugely productive in their careers. So
I agree, and you're a shining example, like a beacon of that, of course. And like, if I compare myself to you, I think the one big difference, a big move I had is, you mentioned representation theory, sure, but it's actually, like, I'm not actually doing a lot with that. Some of the papers have come out recently because they take years. So because I did shift, and I shifted about 10 years ago to this, digital innovation, architectural, Youngins, Anderson Clark, this kind of body. And that is now my go-to theory. So I feel almost as comfortable with this entire architectural view of digital innovation and digital material and all that stuff as I have felt with representation. But if you think about it, that's a
Yeah.
20-year career or 18 years, and
Yeah.
it's two. And they're both
Yeah.
theories, by the way. So it's the same
Yeah.
thing. So these are
Yeah.
the two areas, and I don't have a third, I don't think, and I don't think anyone looking at me would say I have a third either, right? So
Yeah.
you can't do 10 of those. I don't know
Yeah.
how you could anyway.
Yeah. And that's actually our overlap because modularity theory is something I've always been fascinated by, and that's how I'm backing into architecture stuff. So the stuff I'm doing with
Exactly, right?
Julian and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. All right, dude. This is the end of our season.
It is. It's the seventh. We finished 7 seasons, 80 plus episodes. And, I looked up the stats. We're still growing. I find it amazing. It's not exponential. Like I don't think we get Series D backing from investors or anything like that, but it's still growing and people keep on
I
coming
remember,
back.
so 4,000 rough people generally say the information systems field is around 4,000 people worldwide, right?
Yeah, about
So,
that.
and you told me at one point when I asked you about how many are listening, it's around the order of 3 or 4,000 each episode, right?
Yeah.
So, and some episodes more.
Well, it's
Yeah,
pretty constant. I think, yeah, every year we have a favorite episode. I think the big one from last year was the one with Paul Leonardi. Or was it this
yeah.
year? Anyway, so we've had so many of them. But I wanted to use your, I just wanted to say
This year it was
thanks.
probably Jason Thatcher. You showed me that we got like a 40% Jason Thatcher bump, didn't we? So
We,
so
we
far
get
this
we
year.
got a little bump when he announced it on LinkedIn. That might just be reach, dude. We'll
Yeah.
see how many, like in the long run, whether you get listened to more. There's some patterns in terms of what, which people love when we talk about how to write papers, like
Yeah.
these are the clickbaity ones. Maybe it's the title. Hey, I wanted to say thanks. Thanks to all the listeners, man. I mean, it's great. We keep on doing this because people listen to it. If people stop listening, we'd stop doing it. I mean, I think that's a
Yeah.
fact. And just shout out to everyone that is apparently still excited for this, the fortnightly Wednesday when a new episode comes out, and
Yeah.
it's been good. Look at Nick. Nick's been coming to Europe every 3 weeks because people keep inviting him, and I refuse to believe it's for his scholarship. I think it's only because he's a famous podcast host.
Of course it is. And then I go to these places and people bring up references from our podcast, like obscure things we say to each other, and then someone brings them up to me. Yeah.
Oh well. All right. And then final shout out, just because I'm a nerd, last night I came home and I saw there's a new issue of the Scandinavian Journal of IS.
Hmm.
And they have this beautiful special issue in honor of Ole Hanseth. Ole
Yeah.
Hanseth is known for, he's an infrastructure guy, right? He wrote some key infrastructure papers. And it's a beautiful special issue if you're interested in the history of the field, especially the European history, because they take the opportunity to go back to and talk about the Scandinavian tradition. There's a great paper by Kalle about the Scandinavianized tradition, by Ole himself. Eric Montero has a piece in there. Janis has a piece. It's a wonderful special issue. There's probably intellectual merit there too. But really, if you're interested in our field, have a look at this. We'll put a link in the show notes and just learn more about where we've come from. And
Hmm.
again, thanks to those people that organized it. I think Tina was involved. Uh, um, and, like people care and people do stuff. There's also an AIS historian, is AIS history website where I looked up you being an award winner. And you can look up all the other award winners too. Anyway, so there's people doing a lot of service, lots of cool stuff. And if people really want to make this profession their home and spend their life and a professional career in it, big thanks to all the people that curate and do these things.
Yeah. They're just pretty. I'm going to check it out. All right, my brother. Have fun in the south of France in your little
Are you
villa
going to take
and
some time
enjoy.
off? Or are you just going to be an American and work your ass off
Dude,
until you get a tumor or
I always
something?
take time off, but it's just a couple days here and there. I don't do these like 2 weeks of vacation, right? I have a 3-day threshold for vacationing. So, yeah.
3 days, the threshold for vacation. So you and I, we're going to meet in Chicago for
Hmm.
AOM. That's
Yeah.
the next time we talk. And then after that, we'll get back to doing the podcast. And we already have a couple of guests lined up for the winter
We
season, don't
do.
we? Yeah,
Yeah, we do. All right. Well, we'll let people know what that is when we come back. All right.
absolutely. All
So,
right.
all
Nick,
right.
it was a pleasure and an honor as usual. Take care of
All right,
yourself.
my brother. See you.